Saying it's good to be seen. So, quick, grab a donut, sit down, let's go.
An emergency, we're on a coffee cup.
Oh.
We're not on a coffee cup, Joe. Stop yourself.
All right. No fighting, boys. All right, let's begin with a little prayer this morning in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The prayer is called Anima Christi. Soul of Christ, sanctify me. Body of Christ, save me. Blood of Christ, inebriate me. Water from the side of Christ, wash me. Passion of Christ, strengthen me. O good Jesus, hear me. Within thy wounds hide me. Suffer me not to be separated from you. From the malignant enemy, defend me. In the hour of my death, call me. And bid me to come to you, that your saints and I may praise you forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So, someone gave me a little clipping. It's a little newspaper, a comic strip clipping. It's like a minister up there preaching at a pulpit. Have you ever see the comic strip Mother Goose and Grimm?
Oh, yes. Yeah, right.
Okay, so it's those preachers. So preachers up there. How come preachers are always posed with their finger up in the air like that? In case their words don't have an effect, that you know what direction they're pointing at. So the preacher says, my sermon today is from St. Paul. He gets all his sermons from Minnesota. St. Paul, Minnesota. Actually, there may be a lot of truth to that because there's a number of religious publishing houses in Minnesota that provide homily reflections for preachers and so on. All right, so we've been studying the book of Macabbes and getting a handle on the Maccabean revolt. Now, today I want to go through and talk about each of the four main Maccabeans that fostered their revolt. And when you stop to think of it, it's a relatively short period of time. So the father, the old priest, Matthias, and then Judas, and then which one? Jonathan, and then Simon. Huh? And of course, Maccabean, that wasn't their last name, was it? That wasn't their last name.
No.
Okay. But it was actually the nickname that was given to the second one, Judas Maccabeus. Now, we're going to focus on the guys. Last week I kind of tried to provide for you the historical setting, what was going on. The Greek Empire was beginning to decline. The Roman Empire was on the rise, and where Judaism had its center, what is called Palestine, was kind of caught in between, all right? From a geopolitical standpoint, right? And the old Greeks, they did something to really set off these Maccabees. The Greek king Antiochus IV. Now, and the time period we're talking about is around 166 BC. And there was what was going on, of course I said, influence the Jew was a Hellenization of Jewish people. Hellenization. Trying to impose Greek culture upon them. And I don't know if you caught that, but a couple of things we talked about. How did they do that? Well, they put up Greek shrines, Greek gods and goddesses, but they also put up gymnasiums in the big cities. Remember? And what happened at the gymnasium? They didn't play basketball at these things, okay? They did, Greek athletics, and it was training in military skills, but it was also training centers for Greek culture and philosophy and life and lifestyle and so on. And so they're like the ancient form of a youth group, of youth groups. But they also imposed that ideas on the Jewish youth, that that their circumcision was an embarrassment, and what, you Jews, you don't have bacon with your eggs in the morning? What's wrong with you? Bacon is good. You don't eat ham? Why not? How about a little thin prosciutto? Okay? So gradually this had an effect. The Hellenization of Jewish people in Palestine. And some of these, it really, for this family, that was bad. That was no good. Now, old Matthias, he was considered a high priest or a priest family. He wasn't from Jerusalem, he was from Modi'in, which is about 15 miles north and west of Jerusalem, kind of near the hill country, the Shephelah as it's called. And he just popped off. He just couldn't stand it anymore. So we take a look at chapter 1. From First Maccabees, chapter 11 and 10, it tells about the gymnasium and all that, and the various campaigns. The Greek Seleucid king Antiochus waged war against the Egyptian colonies, and that caused a bind. It put them in conflict with one another. So starting with chapter 2, it talks about Maccabee, Matthias. So I'm looking at chapter 2. And just to set this up, starting at verse 15, the officers of the king, in charge of enforcing the apostasy, came to the city of Modi'in to organize the sacrifices, and many of Israel joined them, but Matthias and his sons gathered in a group apart. And when the officer of the king addressed them, very politely, verse 19, Matthias answered in a loud voice, although all the Gentiles of the king's realm obey him, so that each forsakes the religion of their fathers and consents to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kinsmen will keep the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king, nor depart from our religion in the slightest degree. So just when he finished, one of the Jewish guys in the crowd from Modi'in stepped forward to offer the Greek sacrifice on the altar. And verse 24, when Matthias saw him, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved with just fury. And he sprang forward and killed him on the altar. And at the same time, he killed the messenger of the king who was forcing him to sacrifice. And he tore down the altar. He showed his zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did with Zimran, the son of Shalom. And then Matthias gives the speech in front of the whole city, but he also began, verse 39, Matthias and his friends heard of it. They mourned the death. The king had taken the city of David, Jerusalem, and he said, on that day they came to a decision. Let us fight against anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not all die as our kinsmen, dead in hidden places. And then they were joined by the Hasidim, valiant Israelites, all of them devout followers of the law. They gathered an army, and they struck down sinners in their anger, and lawbreakers of the wrath, and the survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. So, what we get by looking at this, the old grandpa, Matthias, zealous for the law, his revolt began, and he killed not Gentiles, but Jews who were going over to the Gentile side, those who were offering sacrifices to the Greek gods and so on. That was the beginning of it. But later on, after he dies, then and his son takes over, then it'll be wars against the various Greek forces. I gave you a nice little colored map last time. Maybe some of you still have that. And if not, I don't know, boys, if there's any left. All out? Amazing. Okay, so if you have it, share it. Especially if you're sitting next to someone who doesn't have it, okay? I have to get some more. Okay, so on here, now here's the other thing. If you take a look at this, and if you can read the ledger that gives the mileage and so on, the area in which a lot of this activity of the Maccabees takes place, the area in square miles is not very big. Basically, it's about 20 miles wide and about 20, maybe 30 miles long in the hill country of Judea. Okay? You see that? It's a very concentrated area of land. Now, but, a couple of things. We who have been raised here in the Fox River Valley and in the state of Wisconsin, we're flatlanders. you know, we call, there's a cliff on the north side of the Lake Winnebago. What do we call it? Yeah, it's not very high, really. It's only because you climb up there and you can see almost the Fond du Lac on the other side, 50 miles, right? You know, it's not very high. We don't have many high places here in the state of Wisconsin. And certainly, if you ever went to Israel and saw the land, it's drastically different, okay? And where Jerusalem is, I told you this before, it's the watershed. And that means that Jerusalem is just about at the high point of the Judean mountains. They would call them hills. But coming from the Mediterranean Sea, which would have been the main track that Greek armies and later on Roman armies and armies would attract, you know, right close to the sea coast. And from the Mediterranean Sea, you go in, you know, 10, 15 miles, and all of a sudden the foothills start. Foothills. In the Hebrew language, even today, they call it Shephelah, foothills. Foothills are like, well, one of the highest places around here is in Wausau. Rib Mountain. We call it a mountain. They call it a foothill. Okay? Just for comparison. But it's crazy. It's not, it just doesn't go up. There's all kinds of valleys and you know, you know, folds in the mountains that you have to walk up. But also that provides, especially in these times before Christ, an excellent place for ambush, if you know the territory. Okay? So that's what the Maccabees used to their advantage when the Greek armies started coming. Because the Greek armies were used to having a whole bunch of soldiers in, you know, armored stuff and walk in phalanxes, you know, 10, 20 wide, you know, all marching together like that into war, and spears and archers and so on, and elephants leading the way, and cavalry and chariots and so on. Well, let me tell you something. You know, chariots, they work real good if you're fighting on a flat plain, huh? But if you got to go up, you know, valleys and so on, and you know, ridges, that doesn't work too well, right? And then elephants are a great advantage to you if you're on a flat land. But elephants are not going to be a great advantage to you if you have to be climbing hills and so on. They get tippy. Okay. So again, you know, what I'm saying is just the terrain. And as we look, and we're not going to look at all of these battles, because in a very short period of time, Judas Maccabeus, the third son, led a revolt, and it was for a short period of time only. You got 66 years. Or 6 years. From 66 to 160 BC. And from chapter 3 through chapter 9 of this book is all about their little, his great victories. Of course, you know, that has to be taken with a grain of salt. What do they say? What's the old saying? To the victor goes the history. Let's change it. To the victors go the history. And the Jews knew how to write. Okay? So when you read through this and it says, the Greek armies, they had all these tens of thousands of men, and Judas Macabbes, the hammer, he comes at them with 3,000 men or so on. They might have been good at writing history, they weren't too good at math. Okay. And after many generations, there's exaggerations. 10 and 1,000 fool, maybe. But it's interesting when you go through this section, the small victories that he had, and it tells the names of the various Greek generals. But it also tells the names of some of the towns that are familiar with us. Most of these towns are in the hill country. Beth Horon, Emmaus, Mitzpah. Between chapters 3 and 4, most of the great victories of Judas and his brothers and those who were fighting with him, and 40% of the story centers around his exploits. Basically, what you have to consider them, they're like freedom fighters. They carried on guerrilla warfare against the Greeks, basically. Okay? And the Greeks, of course, they encamped, and they had these big camps, and they had corrals, and so on. And then Judas and the boys, they knew the territory, so they hid out, they knew where the bushes and the rocks were and to shield them. And, they struck when the Greeks weren't expecting them to strike. The other thing that happened then is they picked up the Greek weapons and the Greek armor. And they plundered the Greek camps. And so as that happened, they gained more and more. And here's kind of an interesting little note I found fascinating. And that's chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. This is one of the early battles, if you want to call it a battle. So, verse 10, chapter 3. Then Apollonius gathered the Gentiles, meaning the Greeks, together with a large army from Samaria to fight against Israel. And when Judas learned of it, he went out to meet him and defeated him and killed him. Many fell wounded, and the rest fled. Their possessions were seized. See what I mean? Okay. And the sword of Apollonius was taken by Judas, who fought with it for the rest of his life. So, not only would that have been symbolic, but also it was probably a superior weapon to what the Jewish guerrilla fighters had. It was a superior weapon, and it was an indication of the plunder that they kept. Now, over and over, if you want to read through the battles, you can in this section. If you're into that kind of stuff and so on, we're not going to look that closely at it. But I'm just going to point out, the author is careful to portray Judas Maccabeus as, number one, being righteous, right with God. Okay? Number two, he prays and fasts and asks his troops to pray and fast before battles. And before some of these battles, there is actually the prayer, the invocation to the Lord High God, the Jewish God, before battle. He reminds his army how God helped Israel in historical events. and battles in the past. And even when faced with extreme odds, he is just so fired up. He would have made a good football coach. He is so fired up, and he has them think, our God, and the greatest victory was against Egypt, passing through the Red Sea, right? Okay, and all Egypt's Pharaoh's armies and so on, and so he'll go back to that. Of course, most of them, thought it happened like just a couple of years ago, and it happened a lot over a thousand years. And then when they have victories, in the text, the historian praises God, has him praise God for their great victories. But, the great victories have to be taken with kind of a grain of salt. That they were basically, guerrilla skirmishes in this rocky hill country. Now, one thing that really ticked them off was when the Greek king, Antiochus IV, had the abomination of desolations, as it was called, a Greek shrine or altar to Greek gods, placed over the altar right before the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So, gaining access to the temple and tearing down that edifice was most important. And Judas did that after 3 years. Let's see, verse 4, chapter 4. After, as it said, crushing General Lysias, the Greek, and chapter 4, verse 34. And then they engaged in battle, and about 5,000 of Lysias's men fell in hand-to-hand fighting. And when Lysias saw his ranks beginning to give way, and the increased boldness of Judas, whose men were ready either to live or to die bravely, he withdrew to Antioch and began to recruit mercenaries so as to return to Judea with greater numbers. Then Judas and his brothers, verse 36, now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up to purify the sanctuary and rededicate it. So the whole army assembled, went up to Mount Zion, that is Jerusalem, and they found the sanctuary desolate, the altar desecrated, the gates burned, weeds growing in the courts, as in a forest, or on some mountain, and the priest's chambers demolished. Quite a description, huh? So, then they tore their clothes, made great lamentation, they sprinkled their heads with ashes, they fell on their faces to the ground. A lot of theatrics here. And when the signal was given with trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Judas appointed men to attack those in the citadel, while he purified the sanctuary. See, the Greeks had built like a fortress just just north of the temple area to kind of defend their shrine. And so he chose blameless priests devoted to the law, purified the sanctuary, carried away the stones of the abomination to an unclean place, and they deliberated what ought to be done with the altar of Holocaust that had been desecrated. And the happy thought came to them, tear it down, lest it be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled. So they tore down the altar, and they stored the stones in a suitable place in the temple hill, while a prophet should come to decide what to do with them. And then they took uncut stones, according to the law, built a new altar, like the former one, and they also repaired the sanctuary, and so on. And they, verse 49, they made new sacred vessels. They brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. They burned incense in the altar. They lit lamps in the lampstands, illuminated the temple. They also put loaves on the table, hung up the curtains, and thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. Early in the morning, then, on the 9th day, and so on, they rose. They offered sacrifices according to the law. On the anniversary of the day in which the Gentiles defiled it, and on that very day it was reconsecrated with songs and harps and flutes and cymbals. For 8 days, verse 56, for 8 days they celebrated the dedication of the altar and joyfully offered holocausts and sacrifices and deliverance of praise. And they ornamented the facade of the temple. There was great joy among the people now that the disgrace of the Gentiles was removed. And when Judas and his brothers and the entire congregation of Israel, they cried that the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness in the anniversary every year for 8 days from the 25th day of the month of Sheslach. So, that celebration continues yet today.
Hanukkah.
It's called what?
Hanukkah.
Okay, so this whole thing is basically to describe the origins of the Jewish feast day of Hanukkah. It's spelled in various ways. And Hanukkah is for 8 days. This year, it starts December 12th. It's usually in December. So it's also known as the Festival of Lights, and which is a designation that was given to us actually by Flavius Josephus. It's very special. It's an 8-day celebration
I don't know that.
in which they have a menorah, candles. Okay, so that's the great symbol for Hanukkah, and it's a great festival, and that they continue to do yet today.
Father, Tom was asking why the date, December 12th. It moves around, doesn't it,
Yeah,
with the calendar time?
right. As they use the Jewish calendar,
But, yeah.
so it's flexible. It's not the same date every year.
Not
All right.
everybody used our calendar of the
Yeah.
day.
So, basically, Judas Macabbes, he had great success carrying out guerrilla warfare and tactics. They depended upon surprise. Why? Because he and his family knew the terrain, the narrow approaches leading up to Jerusalem. And also, and of course, the author here of Maccabees attributes the success and the victories to his piety, as we saw. They prayed and fasted and so on, and thank God afterwards. But there's even more of that in the second book. And the prayers are inspirational if you read through it. We're not going to do that today. And basically, the capture of Jerusalem, which is seen as the greatest victory, happened in December of in our reckoning, 164 BC. 164 BC. Okay. Now, tore down the abomination, and actually, to a certain extent, he kind of had this success, and then he tried to make peace with the Gentiles, with the Greeks, and something else was happening, for the Greeks, and that is the king Antiochus IV, which who was highly demonized in Jewish history because he put up that abomination of desolation and so on, and he was make himself out like a new Alexander the Great. But he dies in 162. And that's the other thing that's kind of overlaid on this history is that just when, one of the Seleucid kings are getting strong, all of a sudden they get bumped off, they get assassinated, they're in a battle, they get killed, Then there's a power lag and a power gap, and then a couple other generals fight to, be the new king, and then they might have an idea, well, let's go and take over Egypt, where the other generals, Ptolemy is, and they can't get anywhere there because the Ptolemies made peace. And so did the Jewish people. These Jews, they sent emissaries, even Judas Macabbes sent emissaries to Rome and asked to be recognized by Rome. And there's no indication they got any military training or anything from them. But, Rome plays kind of a hidden role here in this history. Antiochus, he basically, he had his capital over here in Babylon. But for the Middle East, he had Antioch here in Syria as when he came this way. And Antiochus, he would come with his armies trying to get at the Ptolemy Greek generals here in Egypt. Well, when he came through with his armies, they didn't go in the Saudi Arabian desert. They weren't used to that. They came along this narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean Sea that we call Palestine. So when they were turned back, and he was turned back to Antiochus because he found out the Ptolemies had a treaty with Rome. And so that's when he went back and conquered Jerusalem and put up that abomination, desolation. Rome kind of plays at this point. We always think of the big Roman Empire, and so on. This is right at the beginnings of Rome. Okay? It isn't the big, monolithic, fearful empire that it became later on, like 100 years later. Okay? So it wasn't quite at that stage yet. Yeah.
This might be a broad brush of stroke, but the Maccabeans were more interested not in land, but in freedom for their faith. So the battles they fought, the guerrilla warfares, were to establish places or citadels to practice their faith in freedom. Yeah. But they were not after land in a sense as the mass.
They wanted to be left alone.
Yeah.
Up there in the hill country. They wanted to be left alone by these. And of course we have to recognize the more these little victories that Judas and his followers and his band of merry men had against the Greeks, the more plunder they got from the Greek armies, the more they became strongly armed themselves in that way. And then the Greeks had a hard time using their own military tactics against them because of the lay of the land. He tried to reach out to Rome. Judas did. Chapter 8 talks about a treaty with Rome. Chapter 8, the first Maccabees, and there's a footnote here that will get, kind of sums up this whole section here. This chapter contains an account of the embassy which Judas, Macabbes, Judas sent to Rome, probably before the death of Nicanor, to conclude a treaty of alliance between Rome and the Jewish nation. Without precise chronology, the pertinent data are gathered into a unified theme. The image of the Roman Republic greatly impressed the smaller Eastern peoples seeking support against their overlords. Overlords here, probably talking about the Greeks, okay? Because of Rome's success in war and effective aid to their allies, numerous interventions by Rome in the politics of the Near East bear witness to its power and prestige in the 2nd century. They should have growing power and prestige. With the Roman control of Palestine in 63 BC, the Republic and later Empire became heartily detested. The eulogy of Rome in this chapter is one of the reasons why 1st Maccabes was not preserved by the Palestinian Jews in the century that followed. So you can read through this, and it actually praises Rome. But here it gives us kind of a, insight. We are so focused on Rome from our New Testament perspective, right? So what this indicates to the righteous Jewish people actually invited treaty and alliance with Rome. Before Rome was like the Roman Empire, in order to have help against the Greeks and the Greek culture. And this was 100 years before Rome overtook and took possession, if you will, of Palestine, which is 63 BC. Okay? So, the death of Judas Maccabes. Let's take a look at that. It's in chapter 9. It's sad. So, chapter 9, it talks about, again, a battle. The Greeks are battling one another, and they have names of generals and so on. Verse 11, then the army of Macabbes moved out of camp and took its position in combat. Cavalry was divided into squads, and, well, we don't have to go through all that. Those who were on Judas's side also blew their trumpets. The earth shook, and the noise of the armies in the battle raged from morning till evening. Seeing that Macabbes was on the right, the main force of his army, Judas, with all the most stout-hearted rallying to him, drove back the right wing and pursued them as far as the mountain slopes. And when the men on the left wing saw that the right wing was driven back, they turned and followed Judas and his men, taking them in the rear. That's not a body part. The battle was fought desperately, and many on both sides fell wounded. And then Judas fell, and the rest fled. Jonathan and Simon took their brother Judas, buried him in the tomb of their fathers, and Modi. And all Israel bewailed him in great grief. They mourned for him many days, and they said, how the mighty one has fallen, the Savior of Israel. The other acts of Judas, his battles, his brave deeds he performed, and his greatness have not been recorded, but they were very many. Okay. They weren't recorded. How do they keep track of this? They weren't recorded. How come it didn't pass into history without any other further mention. How did Israel, okay, I heard verbal stories. What's the best way to pass on verbal history?
In song.
In song. Right, in song. And, you know, if you take a look at the beginning of First Maccabees, I think it's in chapter 2, there's the verses, I know in this chapter, we're not going to look at it, but there's verses, and they're arranged like poetically, which probably indicates, especially in the New American Bible, that it was transposed through song. Okay? And there was a long tradition in Hebrew, Jewish history, of doing that, passing on their history through song. Yeah? But
Were there any other historical accounts by other sources about these battles? And I mean, you mentioned the amount of people, or was this just kind of the booties, some guys that were,
well, there was no other contemporary ones, but later on, Flavius Josephus, in his 4-volume work of the history of the Jews, gives his account of it. But Josephus, wrote almost 200 years later. Okay, pulling from sources and so on. And of course, Flavius Josephus was a Jew who initially began the fight against the Roman Empire and then went over to the Roman side. And the Romans basically employed in him to keep a chronology of basically the Jewish wars against Rome. But he also wrote the history. So it would be Flavius Josephus at the mid to latter part of the 1st century AD. Okay? Okay, any other queries? No? Okay. So after we see that alliance, that treaty with Rome, and Judas is killed, his brother Jonathan, and Jonathan is found, between chapter 9 and chapter 12 of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And the time period for Jonathan, the next brother, is then from 160 to, I think, 142. Yeah, 142. You have that on the little outline on the map. BC. It's quite a while. And it says that he led a guerrilla war from the Judean desert, eventually establishing a base at Michmash. And he was appointed high priest in 152, taken prisoner and then executed by the Seleucid Trypho in 143. Now, Michmash. I don't know if it's on this one. So it's right here is Michmash. It's not far from Jerusalem, north, but more towards the desert side. Okay? North and east. Is that west? West. North and west. Not far from Jericho, but Jericho is more in the wilderness, the desert. Michmash is more like hill country, but it's on the other side, the west side of the watershed. Okay, and that's where Jonathan takes up. Jonathan uses hit and run warfare. However, he also, because the Greeks had incompetent leadership because they were fighting amongst themselves after Antiochus died. And the generals were fighting amongst themselves as well to try to take power and so on. And Jonathan kind of moves in. He goes to this historical village called Michmash, and he pursues to have, or persuades them to have him appointed as high priest, the Jewish high priest. Okay? Now, the Maccabean family, well, even though the old grandpa was a priest, he wasn't necessarily a high priest, I didn't put that wrong, but he was a priest, but they weren't part of the Levi tribe, for instance, which was the tribe of priests. Okay? So they, ancestrally, from a religious standpoint, they should not have been appointed, or someone from their family should not have been appointed high priest. But he got himself appointed high priest because he was more political than his brothers and his dad. What's telling is right at the end of chapter 9, right at the end of chapter 9, verse 70. Jonathan learned of this, and he sent emissaries to make peace with them and to obtain release of prisoners. Now this was after the Jews were fighting with themselves and so on. He agreed to do as Jonathan had asked, and swore an oath to him that he would never try to injure him or for the rest of his life. Released prisoners and had previously taken from the land of Judah. He returned to his own country and never came back into the territory. Then the sword ceased in Israel, and Jonathan settled in Michmash and began to judge the people, and he destroyed the impious in Israel. Now, that last statement is significant. He began to judge the people. There's a whole book of Judges, right? Huh? And the whole book of Judges was, various personages that, 1,000 years before this, when, after Joshua died, and there was no other leadership amongst the Jewish people, certain folks rose up as judges. And so, now this is the author or editor's perspective. All right? It's their perspective on how Jonathan functioned. If the author was really real diehard, ultra orthodox, like Matthias and Judas, the Maccabean, he might have downplayed this or watered it down or not even mentioned it. Because Jonathan got that position because of his alliance with the Greeks. And basically his peace. And during a time period when the Greeks were going through their own power transition and power struggle. Did they?
Michael and govern, that's a lot different than judge.
Well, yeah.
So if you're reading this Bible, you're going to get a whole different idea than what judge is.
You'll get a different idea, yes, in that, right.
Translation.
And, but that's because that translation is meant for youth.
You should have the right interpretation.
Well, don't they have a good footnote? A footnote?
No.
That's a shame. Here, the New American Bible, they have a footnote on that passage. No, but you bought it. Oh, you stole it from church? Oh, you were a catechist and you just kept it. Okay, all right. So, footnote in the New American Bible, grown-up Bible, For verse 70, chapter 9, verse 73, began to judge. That is, exercise the government, governing authority as in the book of Judges. When Jerusalem and the garrison towns firmly in Seleucid hands, Jonathan's freedom of action was greatly restricted. Michmash, south and east of Bethel, famous for the exploit of the former Jonathan, son of Saul. So this city was famous, Michmash, going way back to the time period of the first king, King Saul. And so it was, from that standpoint, it was very significant. He ends up making alliances also with Rome. And he was granted through Rome control. From the Greek standpoint, when the Greek Alexander came about, Jonathan represented the Jewish interests at a wedding, the wedding of King Alexander. Okay? And some have him as a groomsman. Who did King Alexander, the Greek Seleucid king, marry? He married the daughter of the Ptolemy king from Egypt. Her name, Cleopatra. But it wasn't the famous Cleopatra. I mean, this is a Cleopatra from 100 years before. Anthony and Cleopatra, that's going to come 100 years later. Okay. But the Cleopatra, who was the daughter of a Ptolemy king, which meant she was of Greek ancestry, married the King Alexander from the Seleucid standpoint. However, God bless you. However, if you look more closely in some footnotes or historical accounts, this Cleopatra maybe set the stage for the latter Cleopatra, because this Cleopatra married 2 or 3 other Greek kings after that. What a woman she was. Or her daddy used her as a political
chess piece.
point. Yeah, marrying them in order to have more of a family alliance and so on. If you read on, but now, another, around 143, 142, another rival to the Greek throne came about by the name of Trypho, and it's during the reign of Trypho that Jonathan basically is going to be assassinated. If you want to get the juicy details about this wedding of Alexander, you can look and read for it yourself. Chapter 10, starting from verse 51 to about 66. Now, we have a couple more of these Maccabees to look at, Simon, and then setting the stage with someone called John Hyrcanus. So we'll get into that next week. I want to thank you very much for coming, everyone.